The man no one recognized. The rain fell softly over the city streets that night, turning sidewalks into mirrors of dim yellow lights. Inside a busy restaurant, the warm glow of lamps filled the space. But not everyone inside felt that warmth. Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple worn jacket and faded jeans, walked quietly through the door. There was nothing about his look that suggested Hollywood fame or worldwide respect. To the workers and customers, he was just another tired man looking for a place to sit. The manager, a sharp-eyed man with a pressed shirt and too much pride, noticed him right away. He didn't see kindness in the stranger's eyes. He didn't see the quiet dignity Keanu carried. Instead, he saw the old jacket, the hair damp with rain, the shoes scuffed from long walks. And in that moment, he decided this man did not belong. The words came like a blade, cold and careless. "You don't belong here, poor guy," the manager said loudly enough for others to hear. A few heads turned. Some guests chuckled. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't noticed. Keanu stood still, his hands calm at his side. He didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice. But his silence was heavy, almost louder than the insult. Inside, though, he felt a small sting, not for himself, but for how quick people were to judge. He thought of all the times in his life when people had shown him kindness when he had nothing, and how different that had felt compared to this moment. He gave a small nod and said softly, "I just wanted some food, nothing more." But the manager shook his head, smirking. "Places like this aren't for people like you. Go find somewhere else, don't waste our time." For a long second, no one moved. The rain outside grew harder, tapping against the windows like a quiet drum. Keanu could have left. He could have disappeared into the night and no one would ever know who he really was. But something inside him told him to stay. Not to prove his worth, but to see how far the cruelty of one man could go, and how much truth one simple act of patience could reveal. A young waiter, barely 20, stood nearby holding a tray. His face tightened with guilt. He knew the man at the door had done nothing wrong, but fear of losing his job tied his tongue. He lowered his eyes and walked past, his hands trembling. In that moment, Keanu felt more sadness than anger. Sadness that people were afraid to be kind. Minutes later, whispers began to travel through the restaurant. One woman squinted, her fork paused mid-air. "Doesn't he look familiar?" she whispered to her friend. Another man leaned forward, frowning, as if trying to place a face he had seen somewhere far beyond these walls. But before the truth could spread, the manager laughed again. "Look at him, standing there in the doorway like he owns the place. Poor guy doesn't even know his limits." Keanu finally stepped forward, his voice calm, steady, almost like a teacher to a child. "Respect," he said, "costs nothing, but it changes everything." The room went quiet. The laughter faded. Something in his voice, gentle but firm, reached into hearts that didn't expect to be touched. Yet the manager only smirked harder. Big words for a man with no money. Keanu gave a small smile, almost tired, almost knowing. Money doesn't make a person rich. Kindness does. And then, just as the tension reached its highest point, the restaurant door opened again. A group entered, cheerful and loud. One of them froze when he saw the man in the doorway. His eyes widened. His face broke into shock. "Keanu Reeves," he breathed, almost dropping his umbrella. The name traveled like lightning. Whispers became gasps. Gasps became stunned silence. The same customers who had turned away earlier now stared, with open mouths. The waiter who had looked down in fear now looked up with eyes full of hope. The manager's smirk slipped, replaced by confusion, then fear. Keanu stood still, not proud, not angry, simply human. He hadn't needed a name or fame to prove who he was. But in that moment, everyone realized the mistake that had been made. And yet, instead of anger, he said only one thing: "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is how we treat each other when we think no one is watching." The words sank deep, more powerful than any revelation of fame. That night was only the beginning of a story that would test not just one man's pride, but an entire city's idea of what respect, humility, and kindness truly mean. The weight of silence, the restaurant air felt heavy after the truth broke. People who had laughed now sat frozen, forks paused, glasses untouched. Some faces turned, red with shame, others pale with shock. Only the rain outside dared to keep its rhythm, beating against the glass as if reminding everyone that the world moved on, whether they learned their lesson or not. The manager's face twisted as he tried to recover. Pride, fear, and disbelief fought inside him. He wanted to laugh it off, to claim it was all a misunderstanding. But the silence of the room pressed too strongly against him. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how he would respond. Keanu still stood quietly near the doorway. He did not move forward, he did not storm out. He simply waited, like a mirror, letting the manager see his own reflection in this moment of cruelty. Finally, the manager cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves," he said, forcing a smile. I didn't realize it was you. Of course you are welcome here. Please let me get you the best table." The words rang false and everyone knew it. They were not words of respect, only words of fear. Keanu shook his head softly. Respect offered only to those we recognize is not respect at all. It is performance. True respect is given without condition. A woman at the corner table lowered her eyes, remembering how she had chuckled when the insult was spoken. A young couple shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had chosen silence instead of kindness. The waiter who had looked away now bit his lip, wishing he had been braver. And then, to everyone's surprise, Keanu did not walk to the best table. Instead, he chose a small seat near the kitchen door, the least glamorous place in the room. He sat down quietly as if to prove his point. The waiter hurried to serve him, his hand shaking as he placed a glass of water. Keanu gave him a small smile. "Thank you," he said gently. Those two words carried more warmth than the entire restaurant had shown all evening. The young waiter's throat tightened. He whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I should have spoken up." Keanu nodded, his eyes kind. "Courage grows when we use it. Next time, you will." The boy's chest swelled with both guilt and hope, but the manager could not let go of his pride. He walked over, trying to regain control of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we are honored to have such a great actor here tonight. Everything from Mr. Reeves will be on the house." Some customers clapped lightly, desperate to erase their earlier silence. Others forced smiles. Keanu raised his hand. The clapping stopped. "That is not necessary," he said. "What I wanted was a simple meal. Not free, not special, just the same as anyone else." His words cut deeper than anger ever could. People realized he wasn't here to punish or embarrass anyone. He was here to remind them of something they had forgotten. Yet the tension did not end there. Because in the corner, one man muttered under his breath, loud enough for his table but not the whole room. "He's just acting. They all do, pretending to be humble so people love them more." The words slid across the room like poison. Keanu heard them, of course. He always did. But instead of reacting, he looked around the room and asked softly, "How many of you, before tonight, judged me by what I wore, by how I looked?" Silence again. Shame filled the air like smoke. No one wanted to admit it, but almost everyone had. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "This is not about me. This is about how easy it is to forget that every face has a story. Every person carries battles you do not see. We cannot measure worth by clothes, by money, by what we think someone is. We measure it by how we treat them when we believe they have nothing to give us." The rain outside thundered as if agreeing. In that moment, something shifted. The young waiter who had stayed silent finally spoke louder, his voice trembling but firm. "He's right," he said. "I was afraid of losing my job, but I should have said something. He didn't deserve that." The words broke the chain. A woman at the corner raised her hand and said softly, "I laughed. I shouldn't have." Another man added, "I looked away. I regret it." For the first time that night, honesty filled the room. The manager, however, grew restless. His pride couldn't bear it. "Enough of this," he snapped. "You're all overreacting. It was just a joke." But no one laughed anymore. Keanu's eyes held the manager's. Not angry, not cruel, just steady. A joke that wounds is not a joke. It is a weapon. The manager's jaw tightened. He turned and stormed away, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with shame but open with reflection. And as Keanu finally began his meal, the young waiter stood straighter, no longer just a boy afraid of losing his job, but a man who had taken his first step toward courage. That night was not just about recognition, it was about awakening. When whispers leave the room, the rain had eased into a drizzle by the time Keanu finished his meal. The restaurant had grown quieter, not with fear this time, but with thought. People who had come in laughing and gossiping now spoke in softer tones as if they were afraid to disturb the lessons still floating in the air. But outside, something else had begun. A young woman sitting near the window had recorded part of the exchange on her phone. She hadn't meant to. At first it was just shock, a reflex to capture the insult thrown so boldly. But when she realized who the quiet man was, her fingers had trembled and she had pressed record again. Now, as she scrolled through the clip, she whispered to her friend, "Should I share it?" Her friend hesitated. "People will think you're making it up." The woman looked back at the man sitting near the kitchen door. He was eating slowly, almost invisible despite the storm he had caused in everyone's hearts. She whispered, "Maybe people need to see this. Maybe it's not about believing me. Maybe it's about believing him." Within minutes, the video was online. Inside the restaurant, no one knew yet. The waiter refilled Keanu's glass carefully. Customers kept sneaking glances, still struggling to balance their shame with their curiosity. And the manager, though hiding in the back, was boiling with anger, not just at Keanu but at the way his control had slipped through his fingers. But outside, the clip began to move. Likes, shares, and comments lit up screens. Strangers who had never stepped foot in that restaurant were suddenly there, pulled into the moment. One comment read, "This is why I respect him. Not for his movies, but for his humanity." Another said, "Imagine judging a man who has given so much quietly, who has suffered so much loss and still carries kindness." A third cut deeper. "That manager showed us what too many people are like when they think no one important is watching." Back inside, the young waiter finally gathered the courage to ask, "Sir, why didn't you tell him right away who you are? You could have shut him down in seconds." Keanu wiped his hands gently, his voice calm. "Because my name is not my defense. If I had used it, the lesson would have been lost. He would have treated me differently, but he would have learned nothing." The boy nodded slowly as if something heavy had just settled into his heart, yet tension still lingered. A group at another table, emboldened by drinks, whispered to each other. One of them leaned closer and said with a mocking laugh, "He's making a show of it. Actors live for drama." The words pricked the air again. Keanu heard them, but this time he stood. Not in anger, not in pride, but in quiet strength. He walked toward their table. The men looked up, suddenly nervous. "Do you think kindness is a show?" Keanu asked softly. No one answered. Kindness is not performance. It is choice. It costs nothing, yet it changes everything. One word of respect can heal. One word of cruelty can scar. I don't say this as an actor. I say this as a human being who has seen how fragile life can be. His voice cracked just slightly, a reminder of griefs he rarely shared. And for a moment, those who doubted him felt the weight of something real, something beyond fame. The restaurant held its breath again. And then, the door opened. A stranger rushed in, phone in hand. He looked around and gasped. "It's everywhere. The video. It's already everywhere." Heads turned. Customers pulled out their own phones. Screens lit up. The young woman by the window covered her mouth, in shock as she saw her video spreading like wildfire. The manager stormed out of the back, his face pale. "What video?" He barked. Someone showed him. His own voice filled the room, cruel and mocking. "You don't belong here, poor guy." followed by Keanu's calm, steady reply. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. The manager's legs nearly gave out beneath him. In less than an hour, the outside world knew what had happened inside those walls. And suddenly, it was no longer just a private lesson. It was a mirror held up to the entire city, the entire world. The customers stared at Keanu, their shame deepening. The waiter looked both terrified and relieved. And the manager? He realized that what he had thought was power had turned into his downfall. Keanu sat back down, his meal untouched now. He whispered more to himself than anyone else. The truth always finds its way out. Always. And though he spoke quietly, every ear heard him. When the city begins to watch by the next morning, the video had grown beyond the restaurant. Millions of people had seen it, shared it, debated it. News outlets picked it up. Social media filled with hashtags about respect and humility, and everywhere, people were talking about one simple moment inside a small restaurant on a rainy night. The restaurant itself became a storm. Reporters stood outside, cameras flashing, microphones reaching. Customers who had been there the night before were now answering questions they didn't expect. Some admitted their silence with shame. Others tried to twist their part, pretending they had been kinder than they were. Inside, the manager paced like a trapped animal. His name was now known across the city, but not for success, not for leadership. He was known as the man who had mocked a stranger, only to discover that stranger was Keanu Reeves. His phone buzzed endlessly. Angry messages, threats, demands for apology. The restaurant's social media pages overflowed with criticism. Reservations were canceled. Business partners distanced themselves. He slammed his phone onto the counter. "This is not fair," he muttered. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" The young waiter, standing nearby, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but steady. "You weren't supposed to know who he was. You were supposed to respect him anyway." The words cut deeper than any headline. The manager's face flushed with anger. "Don't talk to me like that. You think you're better than me just because you defended him?" The boy shook his head. "No, I think I'm just learning what better means." Meanwhile, Keanu had left the restaurant quietly after that night. He didn't stay to watch the fallout. He didn't seek revenge. He walked back into the rain with the same quiet steps he had entered with. But he knew the ripples would grow. By afternoon, he was spotted outside a small bookstore carrying a bag of old novels, smiling kindly at the owner. Someone took a picture, and soon it was everywhere. The man the world mocked yesterday, spending his day supporting small shops. Comments flooded again. People called him humble, grounded, different. But for Keanu, it wasn't performance. It was just life. He didn't need cameras to remind him to be kind. Yet the pressure on the restaurant and its manager grew unbearable. Angry crowds began to gather outside. Signs were raised. Respect cost nothing. Kindness over pride. Listen to Keanu. The very words he had spoken now became banners for a movement larger than the moment itself. The manager called his staff together. His voice was tight with fear. "We need to fix this. Someone has to release a statement. We'll say it was all a misunderstanding." The young waiter looked him in the eye. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was disrespect. If you don't own it, people won't forgive you." The manager sneered, but deep inside, his hands trembled. He realized he had no shield anymore. His excuses meant nothing. Across the city, people debated. Some said the world was too harsh, punishing one man for one mistake. Others said the lesson was necessary because it showed what happens when people judge without kindness. But the truth was larger than one man. The story had become a mirror, forcing everyone to ask themselves, how many times had they dismissed someone based on clothes, on appearance, on assumptions? How many times had they laughed or stayed silent instead of choosing kindness? That night, the young waiter walked home slowly, his heart still heavy but stronger than before. He thought about the words Keanu had given him. Courage grows when we use it. He whispered them again, as if to plant them deep inside his soul. Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment across town, Keanu sat alone by the window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. His phone buzzed endlessly, too. Calls from journalists, offers for interviews, invitations to talk shows. He ignored them all. He whispered to himself, "This isn't about me. It's about us." And with that, he knew the story wasn't finished, because the real test wasn't the video going viral. The real test was whether people would carry the lesson beyond the screens, into their everyday lives. The breaking point, the 5th day after the video spread, the restaurant stood almost empty. Tables that once carried the hum of conversations were now deserted. The once busy kitchen had gone quiet, pans hanging untouched. Only the sound of angry voices outside filled the air as protesters and curious onlookers gathered with signs and cameras. The manager sat in his office, his head in his hands. His pride, the thing he had carried like a shield, now weighed on him like a chain. Every headline carried his name with words like arrogant, cruel, heartless. His friends had stopped calling, his family refused to answer, and his business partners demanded distance. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be judged without mercy. He muttered to himself, "One mistake, one moment, and my whole life is ruined." But deep inside he knew it hadn't been just one moment. It had been years of small choices, of seeing people as less than himself, of building his confidence on the weakness of others. The video hadn't destroyed him, it had only revealed him. Still, he wanted escape, so he called a press conference. The next day, the restaurant filled again, not with customers but with cameras, reporters, lights. The young waiter stood in the back, his heart pounding. He didn't trust his boss, but he hoped somehow the man would finally see the truth. The manager stepped forward, his face pale under the bright lights. Microphones crowded before him. He cleared his throat and began, "I want to apologize to Keanu Reeves, to my customers, to the world. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was. If I had known, I would never have spoken that way." The words echoed, but they fell flat. Reporters exchanged glances. Some even shook their heads, because everyone knew his apology wasn't about respect. It was about reputation. Then from the back, a voice spoke. Soft, but carrying across the room. It was the young waiter. "You still don't understand," he said. The cameras turned. Reporters raised microphones. The manager froze, his face stiff. "Sit down," he hissed at the boy. But the waiter didn't. His hands trembled, but his voice grew steadier. "This isn't about not knowing who he was. It's about how you treated him when you thought he was no one. That's what the world saw. That's what the world will remember." A wave of murmurs rippled across the room. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. And then, the door opened. Keanu Reeves stepped in, dressed in the same simple clothes as that night. The crowd gasped, cameras flashed wildly. But Keanu lifted his hand, asking for silence. He walked forward slowly, his expression calm, almost sorrowful. "Let him speak," Keanu said, nodding at the young waiter. The boy swallowed, tears burning, his eyes. "That night I was afraid. I should have stood up for him, but I didn't. I looked away, and I've thought about it every day since. I don't want to be that kind of man anymore. I want to have courage, even if it costs me." His voice broke, but his honesty filled the room like light breaking through a storm. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that," he said softly, "is the beginning of change." The cameras caught everything, but for once it wasn't about the fame. It was about a young man choosing truth over silence. Then Keanu turned to the manager. Their eyes met, one filled with desperation, the other with quiet strength. "You have a choice too," Keanu said gently. "Not to fix your image, but to fix your heart. The world will forget the headlines one day, but you will always live with yourself. Choose what kind of man you want to be." The manager's lips trembled. For the first time, tears stung his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Pride had built walls inside him for years, and now those walls were cracking. The room waited, holding its breath. And in that silence, Keanu spoke again, his words like a final thread stitching the wound. Respect is not for the famous. Respect is for the human. The crowd erupted, not with cheers but with something deeper. People clapped softly, others wiped their eyes. The moment felt less like a conference and more like a confession, a lesson too powerful to be ignored. Outside, the crowd waiting on the street began chanting the words that had started it all. Respect costs nothing. Respect costs nothing. And as the chant grew louder, the manager felt smaller, the young waiter stood taller, and Keanu, he simply bowed his head, as if to remind himself that this was never about him, but about something greater. The true test, the city could not stop talking about the story. Everywhere people repeated the words, respect costs nothing. Schools discussed it in classrooms, families spoke about it over dinner, strangers debated it on buses and trains. It was no longer just about a restaurant or a manager. It had become a mirror for everyone. But for the manager, the weight was heavier than ever. His business had collapsed, his reputation shattered. Everywhere he went, people whispered. Some pointed, others turned their backs. He finally understood what it felt like to be judged, to be seen only for one mistake. At first, bitterness grew inside him. He told himself he was the victim, that the world had been unfair. But then, late one night, he watched the video again, alone in his apartment. He saw himself sneering, mocking, full of pride. He heard his own voice saying, "You don't belong here, poor guy." And for the first time, he couldn't bear it. Tears slid down his face as he whispered, "That's who I was. I don't want to be him anymore." The next morning, he made a choice. Not to fix his image, not to please the world, but to change. He walked to a homeless shelter at the edge of the city, a place he had passed countless times without a second glance. The director, a kind woman with tired eyes, greeted him cautiously. "What do you need?" she asked. The manager swallowed hard. "Not what I need, what can I give?" And so, he began, scrubbing floors, serving meals, listening to stories he had once ignored. The same hands that had once waved people away now carried trays of food, folded blankets, offered comfort. At first, people doubted him. They thought it was for cameras, for attention. But no cameras came, no headlines followed. And still, he returned every day. Slowly, his pride melted, and in its place grew something he had never felt before: peace. Meanwhile, the young waiter found courage in small ways. He spoke up when co-workers were mistreated. He stood by people others overlooked. He carried Keanu's words like a compass. Courage grows when we use it. As for Keanu, he stayed away from the noise. He didn't give interviews, he didn't make speeches. But one evening, he quietly walked into the shelter. The manager froze when he saw him. Shame flooded his face, but Keanu only offered a gentle nod. "You chose," Keanu said softly. The manager's eyes filled again. "I was wrong. All those years, I thought respect had to be earned with power, with money. But I see now, it begins with me, with how I treat the next person who walks through the door." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let every door be your chance." The two men stood in silence, not enemies anymore, not strangers, but human beings sharing the same fragile truth. That respect is not a gift for the few, but a responsibility for all. In the weeks that followed, the story faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals, new dramas. But something remained. People remembered the lesson. In small moments, in schools, in workplaces, in homes, kindness began to replace cruelty. Respect began to replace judgment. And though the world soon forgot the viral video, the people who had lived it carried the memory in their hearts. Because it was never about fame. It was never about punishment. It was about a simple truth, spoken by a man who asked for nothing but gave everything. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything.